The dust swirled around Jake Mitchell's boots as he rode into Deadwood Creek, his weathered face scanning the bustling town square. The afternoon sun cast long shadows between the wooden buildings, and the sound of hammering mixed with distant laughter from the saloon. Jake pulled his black stallion to a halt near the hitching post, his sharp blue eyes taking in the crowd that had gathered near the auction platform. Jake wasn't like the other men in town. Standing 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and calloused hands, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had survived more than his share of battles. His dark hair fell just past his collar, and a thin scar ran from his left temple down to his jawline, a reminder of his days fighting in the war. But it was his eyes that set him apart. They held a depth of pain and understanding that came from losing everything he had ever loved. 3 years ago, Jake had been a different man. He'd owned a small ranch outside of town, married to a woman named Sarah who had filled his world with light. They'd planned to start a family, to build something lasting together. But then the raiders came one night while Jake was away selling cattle. When he returned, he found nothing but ashes and heartbreak. Sarah was gone, taken by men who disappeared like ghosts into the wilderness. Jake had searched for months, following cold trails and dead ends until his money ran out and his hope died. Now he worked as a hired gun, taking jobs that paid enough to keep him moving from town to town. He'd heard there was work in Deadwood Creek, something about protecting a merchant's supply wagons from bandits. It was honest work, or as honest as anything got in these parts. The crowd near the auction platform grew louder, and Jake found himself curious despite his usual desire to avoid such gatherings. He dismounted and walked closer, keeping to the edges where he could observe without drawing attention. The auctioneer, a fat man in a dirty vest, was calling out numbers while pointing to various items on the wooden stage. "Next up, we have this fine piece of furniture from the Henderson estate," the auctioneer shouted, mopping his sweaty forehead with a handkerchief. "Solid oak table, barely used. Who'll start the bidding at $5? Jake watched as townspeople raised their hands, competing for household goods and farming equipment. It was a typical estate sale, the kind that happened when someone died or lost their land to creditors. He'd seen plenty of them in his travels, each one a small tragedy wrapped in the business of survival. As the afternoon wore on, the crowd began to thin. Jake was about to leave when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. At the far end of the platform, partially hidden behind a stack of wooden crates, stood a group of people who didn't belong at a furniture auction. They were chained together at the wrists and ankles, their clothes dirty and torn. Some were men who looked like they'd been working in mines or lumber camps, but others were clearly different. Jake's jaw tightened as he realized what he was seeing. This wasn't just an estate sale. Someone was selling human beings alongside the furniture and farm tools. His hand moved instinctively to the gun at his hip, but he forced himself to remain calm and observe. Getting himself killed wouldn't help anyone. The auctioneer's voice changed, becoming more businesslike and cold. "Now we move to our final items of the day. These workers come with clean bills of health and are guaranteed for 1 full year. First up, we have this strong young man, perfect for heavy labor or mining work." Jake watched in growing anger as people he'd thought were decent neighbors began bidding on human lives like they were buying livestock. The prices were discussed with the same casual interest as they'd shown for kitchen tables and farming equipment. Each successful bid felt like a knife twisting in Jake's chest. Then he saw her. She stood near the back of the group, her auburn hair catching the late afternoon sunlight despite the dirt and grime that covered her from days of travel. Even in chains and wearing a torn blue dress, she held herself with a dignity that made Jake's heart skip. There was something familiar about the way she moved, the set of her shoulders, but he couldn't quite place it. The woman's green eyes swept across the crowd with a mixture of defiance and desperation. She wasn't broken like some of the others who stared at the ground in defeat. This woman was still fighting, still hoping for something better than the fate that awaited her. "And now for something special," the auctioneer announced with a greedy smile. "This beautiful young woman would make an excellent addition to any household. She's educated, can read and write, and has experience with domestic duties. We'll start the bidding at $50. Jake felt sick as hands began rising around the crowd. Men were bidding on this woman like she was a prize horse, discussing her qualities with calculating eyes. Some of them Jake recognized. The banker, the store owner, even the preacher was nodding thoughtfully, as if considering making an offer. The bidding climbed quickly.
$60.
75. 100. Jake watched the woman's face as the numbers rose, seeing her jaw clench tighter with each new bid. She was trying to remain strong, but he could see the fear creeping into her eyes as the reality of her situation became clear. $125, called out a voice that made Jake's stomach turn. It belonged to Marcus Blackwood, a wealthy rancher known for his cruelty to both animals and people. Blackwood had a reputation that extended far beyond Deadwood Creek, and none of it was good. The man treated his workers like property, and his property like dirt. The woman's composure finally cracked when she heard Blackwood's bid. Jake saw her shoulders tremble slightly, though she still held her head high. Around the crowd, other potential bidders began to back away. Nobody wanted to get into a bidding war with Marcus Blackwood, not unless they had deep pockets and a death wish. $125 going once. The auctioneer called out, his hammer raised and ready to fall. Going twice! That's when it happened. The woman who had remained silent throughout the entire proceeding suddenly spoke, her voice cutting through the afternoon air like a blade. Jake Mitchell, if you're out there, please remember what you promised me under the old oak tree. The words hit Jake like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and making his vision blur. That voice, those words. The memory came flooding back with painful clarity. Sarah, his Sarah, standing beneath the massive oak tree that grew beside their farmhouse. It had been their wedding day, and she'd made him promise that no matter what happened, no matter how dark things got, he would never give up on their love. But it was impossible. Sarah was dead. He'd seen the burnt remains of their home, found her torn wedding dress in the ashes. He'd buried what he thought were her remains in the small cemetery outside town. Yet here was a woman with Sarah's voice, Sarah's way of holding herself, saying words that only Sarah could know. Jake's hand moved to his chest, where he still wore Sarah's wedding ring on a chain around his neck. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst. The world around him seemed to fade away until there was nothing but the woman on the platform and the impossible hope that maybe, just maybe, his wife had somehow survived. The crowd had gone silent after the woman's words, everyone looking round to see if anyone would respond. Marcus Blackwood frowned and leaned forward, clearly annoyed by the interruption. The auctioneer looked confused, his hammer still raised in the air. Jake stepped forward, his legs feeling weak and unsteady. "Wait," he called out, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I want to bid." The woman's head turned toward his voice, and when their eyes met across the crowd, Jake's world shifted on its axis. It was Sarah. Somehow, impossibly, it was his wife. She was thinner than he remembered, her face marked by hardship and suffering, but those green eyes were unmistakable. The way she smiled when she saw him, even through her tears, confirmed what his heart already knew. "Well now," Blackwood said with a cruel laugh, "looks like we have some competition. You sure you want to get into this, Mitchell? I've got deep pockets and a long memory." Jake ignored the threat and looked directly at the auctioneer. "What's the current bid?" $125, the man replied, clearly sensing the tension in the air. Jake reached into his saddlebags and pulled out a leather pouch that contained every penny he'd saved from months of dangerous work. It wasn't much, but it was everything he had. $150. Blackwood's face darkened. $250, Jake responded immediately, though he knew he was now bidding money he didn't have. The crowd murmured with excitement. This was better entertainment than they'd expected from a simple auction. Some people were placing bets on who would win, while others whispered about the woman's strange words and Jake's reaction to them. $300. Blackwood announced, his voice cold and confident. He knew he was pricing Jake out of the bidding, and he seemed to be enjoying every moment of it. Jake's mind raced. He didn't have $300. He didn't have anywhere near that much. But looking at Sarah's face, seeing the hope and desperation in her eyes, he knew he couldn't let Blackwood win. There had to be another way. That's when he remembered the gold pocket watch that had belonged to his father, and his father's father before that. It was the only thing of real value he owned, a family heirloom that he'd planned to pass on to his own children someday. The watch was worth at least $200, maybe more to the right buyer. Jake pulled the watch from his vest pocket, its gold surface catching the sunlight. "I'll add this watch to my bid," he announced. "It's worth more than enough to cover the difference." The auctioneer examined the watch carefully, turning it over in his hands and checking the inscription on the back. After a moment, he nodded. "This is a fine piece. I'll accept it as equivalent to an additional $200, making your total bid $350. Blackwood's face flushed red with anger. "You little fool! he snarled at Jake. You have no idea what you're getting yourself into. That woman is more trouble than she's worth, and when you can't handle her, don't come crying to me. $400, Blackwood bid, his voice tight with rage. Jake felt his heart sink. He had nothing left to offer, no way to match that bid. He'd risked everything, including his father's watch, and it still wasn't enough. He started to speak, to make some desperate offer, when another voice cut through the air. I'll lend him the money. Jake turned to see Doc Henderson pushing through the crowd. The old doctor was one of the few people in town that Jake respected, a man who dedicated his life to helping others regardless of their ability to pay. Doc Henderson's weathered face was set with determination as he approached the auction platform. Doc, you don't need to, Jake began. But the older man cut him off with a wave of his hand. That woman called you by name, son. She knew something that only someone close to you would know. I don't know what the story is, but I can see it in your eyes. Sometimes a man has to take a leap of faith. Doc Henderson pulled out his own wallet and counted out several bills. I'll cover the 400, Jake. You can pay me back when you're able. Jake felt a surge of gratitude so strong it nearly brought tears to his eyes. I don't know how to thank you, Doc. Just treat that woman right, whatever her story is. And maybe tell me the truth about who she is when you're ready. The auctioneer looked between Jake and Blackwood. Do I hear any other bids? Blackwood glared at both Jake and Doc Henderson, his face twisted with fury. For a moment, it looked like he might bid again just out of spite, but then he seemed to think better of it. This isn't over, Mitchell, he said quietly, his voice carrying a clear threat. Not by a long shot. Going once, going twice. Sold to Jake Mitchell for $400, the auctioneer announced, bringing his hammer down with a sharp crack. Jake moved toward the platform as if in a dream, his heart pounding with each step. The crowd began to disperse, disappointed that the excitement was over. Doc Henderson handed over the money to the auctioneer while Jake climbed the steps to reach Sarah. When he got close enough to touch her, Jake hesitated. What if he was wrong? What if this was all some cruel trick of his imagination? But then Sarah looked up at him with those familiar green eyes, and he saw the tears streaming down her cheeks. I knew you'd find me, she whispered. I never stopped believing you'd find me. Jake's hands shook as he reached out to cup her face, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. I thought you were dead. I'd buried you, Sarah. I mourned you for 3 years. They wanted you to think I was dead, she said, her voice breaking with emotion. They burned our house and left my dress behind to make sure you'd stop looking for me. But I never gave up hope that somehow, someday, you'd come for me. The auctioneer approached with the key to Sarah's chains, clearly eager to complete the transaction and move on to other business. Jake took the key with trembling hands and carefully unlocked the shackles around her wrists and ankles. The metal fell away, leaving red marks on her skin that made Jake's jaw clench with anger. We need to get you out of here, Jake said softly, wrapping his coat around her shoulders. Can you ride? Sarah nodded, though Jake could see the exhaustion in her eyes. I can do anything now that you're here. As they made their way through the dispersing crowd, Jake caught sight of Marcus Blackwood watching them from across the square. The man's expression was cold and calculating, and Jake knew they hadn't seen the last of him. But for now, none of that mattered. Sarah was alive, she was free, and she was back in his arms where she belonged. Doc Henderson met them at Jake's horse, his medical bag in hand. Let me take a look at those marks on her wrists, he said kindly, and I think it would be wise for both of you to stay at my place tonight. You'll need time to figure out your next move, and I have a feeling you might need friends close by. Jake helped Sarah up onto his horse and climbed up behind her, feeling her lean back against his chest with a sigh of relief. As they rode slowly through the streets of Deadwood Creek toward Doc Henderson's house, Jake's mind was already working on the questions that needed answers. Who had taken Sarah? Where had she been all this time? And most importantly, what did they need to do to make sure she was truly safe? But those questions could wait until tomorrow. Tonight, Jake just wanted to hold his wife and convince himself that this wasn't all a dream. The woman he'd loved and lost was back in his arms, and he was never going to let her go again. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Doc Henderson's guest room, casting gentle patterns across the wooden floor. Jake sat in a chair beside the bed, watching Sarah sleep peacefully for the first time in 3 years. Her face was relaxed now, free from the fear and tension he'd seen at the auction. But even in sleep, he could see the changes that her ordeal had left behind. The hollow cheeks, the faint lines around her eyes, the way she occasionally whimpered and moved restlessly as if still running from something in her dreams. Doc Henderson had examined Sarah the night before, treating the cuts on her wrists and giving her a mild sedative to help her rest. The old doctor had asked no questions, simply providing the medical care she needed and a safe place to recover. Jake was grateful for the man's discretion and kindness, knowing that not everyone in town would be so understanding about the unusual circumstances of Sarah's return. As Jake sat watching his wife, memories flooded back of their life together before everything went wrong. He remembered the morning he'd left to take their cattle to market, how Sarah had stood on the porch waving goodbye with that beautiful smile of hers. She'd been wearing a yellow dress that day, her auburn hair flowing loose around her shoulders. He'd promised to be back in 3 days with enough money to finally buy the additional land they'd been wanting for their ranch. Instead, he'd returned to find their home reduced to ashes and charred timber. The neighbors had gathered the remains they could find, including what they'd assumed were Sarah's bones, and held a funeral while Jake was still on the trail home. By the time he arrived, she was already buried in the small cemetery outside town, and everyone assumed she had died in the fire that destroyed their house. Jake had blamed himself for not being there to protect her. He'd spent months tracking the men responsible, following every lead and rumor across 3 states, but the trail had eventually gone cold, and Jake had been forced to accept that his wife was gone forever. He'd kept her wedding ring on a chain around his neck and tried to build a new life. But the guilt and grief had consumed him. Now, watching Sarah sleep in the morning light, Jake struggled to understand how she could be alive when he'd mourned her death for so long. What had really happened that night? Who had taken her, and why had they wanted him to believe she was dead? These questions burned in his mind, but he was afraid to wake her and force her to relive what were surely painful memories. Sarah stirred as the sun grew brighter, her green eyes fluttering open, and looking around the unfamiliar room with momentary confusion. When she saw Jake sitting beside her, relief flooded her face, and she reached out to touch his hand as if to make sure he was real. "Good morning, beautiful," Jake said softly, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing her fingers gently. "How are you feeling?" "Better than I have in years," Sarah replied, her voice still hoarse from sleep. "I kept thinking I might wake up and find out this was all a dream." "It's real," Jake assured her, squeezing her hand. "You're safe now, and I'm never going to let anyone hurt you again." Sarah sat up slowly, wincing slightly from the soreness in her muscles. Jake helped arrange the pillows behind her back, and she leaned against them with a grateful sigh. For a few minutes, they simply looked at each other, both trying to process the miracle of being reunited after so long. "I need to know what happened, Sarah," Jake finally said, his voice gentle but serious. "I need to understand where you've been and who did this to you. If we're going to have a future together, I need to know what we're up against." Sarah's face grew troubled and she looked down at her hands. "It's not a pretty story, Jake. Some of it might be hard for you to hear." "I can handle it," Jake replied firmly. "What I can't handle is not knowing. I've spent 3 years blaming myself for your death, thinking I failed to protect you. I need to know the truth." Sarah took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "It was Thomas Garrett and his gang. They'd been watching our place for weeks, learning your schedule and waiting for the right time to strike. They knew you'd gone to market and wouldn't be back for days." Jake's jaw clenched at the mention of Garrett's name. Thomas Garrett was a notorious outlaw who specialized in kidnapping and ransom schemes. The man was cunning and cruel, known for elaborate plans that often involved staging deaths to throw off pursuit. "They came just after sunset," Sarah continued. "I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when I heard horses outside. At first I thought you might have come back early, but then I saw men I didn't recognize surrounding the house. I tried to run, but there were too many of them." Jake's hands clenched into fists as he imagined what his wife had endured. "Why didn't they just take you? Why burn the house and fake your death? Garrett said it was insurance. He knew that if you thought I was still alive, you'd never stop hunting for me. But if you believed I was dead, you'd eventually give up and move on with your life. He wanted to be able to use me for as long as necessary without worrying about you tracking him down." The calculated cruelty of the plan made Jake sick to his stomach. "Where did they take you?" "To a camp in the mountains about 2 days' ride north of here. Garrett had been building up a network of people he could use for various schemes. Some of us were held for ransom, others were used as servants or worse. He kept us moving every few months to avoid detection. Jake could see the pain in Sarah's eyes as she recounted her captivity, and he reached out to take her hand again. You don't have to tell me everything right now. We have time. No, I need to say this, Sarah insisted, her voice growing stronger. For 3 years, I watched other people come and go from that camp. Some were ransomed back to their families. Others just disappeared one day, and we never knew what happened to them. I kept hoping that someone would come for me, that somehow you'd figure out I was still alive. I tried, Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. I spent months following every lead I could find, but Garrett covered his tracks too well. I know you tried, Sarah replied, squeezing his hand, and I never gave up hope. Even when things got really bad, even when Garrett threatened to sell me to someone who would treat me worse than he did, I held on to the belief that you were out there somewhere, still loving me. Jake felt tears stinging his eyes as he listened to his wife's story. The thought of what she'd endured while he'd been convinced she was dead was almost more than he could bear. How did you end up at that auction? Garrett's operation finally got too big for its own good. About 6 months ago, the law started closing in on his mountain hideout. He decided to liquidate his assets and disappear before they could catch him. He sold some of us to traders who specialize in moving people from town to town for auction. Do you know where Garrett is now? Sarah shook her head. He disappeared before the raid happened. But Jake, there's something else you need to know. Yesterday at the auction, when I saw Marcus Blackwood bidding on me, I recognized him. He'd been to Garrett's camp before, buying women for his ranch. The things I heard about what he does to them, she shuddered and couldn't finish the sentence. Jake's blood ran cold as the implications hit him. If Blackwood had won the bidding, Sarah would have ended up in the hands of someone just as cruel as Garrett, maybe worse. The thought of how close they'd come to losing each other again made his stomach churn. We need to get out of Deadwood Creek, Jake said firmly. Blackwood isn't going to forget about yesterday, and if he's connected to Garrett's operation, there might be others looking for you too. Before Sarah could respond, there was a soft knock on the bedroom door. Doc Henderson's voice called out, Jake? Sarah? I've got breakfast ready if you're up for it. And there's something you both need to know. Jake helped Sarah get dressed in some clothes that Doc Henderson's late wife had left behind. The dress was a bit loose on her thin frame, but it was clean and comfortable. When they made their way to the kitchen, they found the doctor waiting with a serious expression on his weathered face. Sit down, both of you, Doc Henderson said, gesturing to chairs at his small dining table. I've got eggs, bacon, and fresh biscuits, but first I need to tell you what I learned this morning. As they ate, Doc Henderson explained what he'd discovered during his early morning rounds. I was treating a patient down by the telegraph office when I overheard something troubling. Marcus Blackwood sent a wire first thing this morning to someone in Denver. The operator couldn't help but notice that it mentioned a woman matching Sarah's description and included the name Thomas Garrett. Sarah's fork clattered to her plate, and Jake felt his blood turn to ice. What exactly did the message say? According to the operator, it was something about the package being recovered and asking for instructions on how to proceed. Blackwood is expecting a reply this afternoon. Jake pushed back from the table, his mind racing with possibilities, none of them good. He's working with Garrett. That's how he knew to bid on Sarah at the auction. It gets worse, Doc Henderson continued. I also heard that Blackwood has hired a dozen new men in the past week. They're not ranch hands. They're gunfighters and bounty hunters. Word around town is that he's planning something big, but nobody knows what. Sarah looked between Jake and the doctor, fear creeping back into her eyes. They're not going to let me go, are they? Even though Jake bought me fair and square at that auction, they're still going to try to take me back. Jake reached across the table and took her hand. Nobody is taking you anywhere. We just need to be smart about how we handle this. Doc Henderson leaned forward, his expression grave. Jake, I've known you since you were a boy, and I watched how you changed after Sarah's supposed death. I also know that you're good with a gun and you're not afraid of a fight. But 12 men against one is suicide, no matter how skilled you are. Then what do you suggest? Jake asked, though he could see from the doctor's expression that he already had something in mind. There's a sheriff in Silver Falls about 30 miles west of here. Name's William Brady, and he's one of the few honest lawmen left in this territory. If we can get Sarah to him safely, he might be able to help sort this out legally. Brady's been trying to build a case against Thomas Garrett for years. Jake considered the suggestion, weighing their options. Staying in Deadwood Creek was obviously not safe, But traveling 30 miles through open country with Blackwood's men looking for them would be dangerous too. On the other hand, if they could reach Sheriff Brady, they might finally have a chance to bring Garrett and his network to justice. "How well do you know this Sheriff Brady?" Jake asked. "Well enough to trust him with your lives," Doc Henderson replied. "He served with me in the war, and he's a man of integrity. More importantly, he's got the resources and authority to protect Sarah while she testifies against Garrett's operation." Sarah looked thoughtful as she listened to their conversation. "If testifying could help shut down Garrett's network and save other people from what I went through, then I'm willing to do it. But how do we get to Silver Falls without Blackwood's men catching us?" Doc Henderson smiled grimly. "I've been thinking about that too. There's an old mining trail that runs through the hills west of town. It's rough going and will take longer than the main road, but it's also less likely to be watched. I could lend you my wagon and a team of horses that know the trail." Jake felt a surge of gratitude toward the older man. "Doc, you've already done more than enough. I can't ask you to risk your neck any further." "You're not asking, I'm offering. Besides, I've got my own reasons for wanting to see Thomas Garrett brought to justice. 3 years ago, a young woman disappeared from the next county over. Her father was a patient of mine, and I watched him die of a broken heart believing his daughter was dead. If there's a chance to prevent that from happening to other families, I want to help." As they finalized their plans, Jake felt both hope and apprehension building in his chest. For the first time in 3 years, he had a real chance at building a future with Sarah. But first, they had to survive the journey to Silver Falls and convince Sheriff Brady to take on one of the most dangerous criminal networks in the territory. That afternoon, as Doc Henderson helped them prepare for the journey, Jake took a moment to look around the small town that had been his home for the past few months. He'd grown to like Deadwood Creek and its people, but he knew they might never be able to return. Once they testified against Garrett and his associates, they would need to start over somewhere far away from the reach of revenge. Sarah seemed to sense his thoughts as she watched him pack their supplies. "Are you having second thoughts?" she asked quietly. Jake turned to her and cupped her face in his hands, looking into those green eyes that had haunted his dreams for 3 years. "Never. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. That's all that matters." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Jake helped Sarah up into Doc Henderson's wagon. The old mining trail stretched out before them, winding through hills and valleys toward an uncertain future. But for the first time since that terrible night 3 years ago, Jake felt like he was finally moving in the right direction. Behind them, the lights of Deadwood Creek began to twinkle in the gathering darkness. Somewhere in that town, Marcus Blackwood was probably planning his next move, reading telegrams from Thomas Garrett and plotting ways to recapture the woman who had slipped through his fingers. But Jake was determined that this time would be different. This time, he wouldn't lose Sarah. This time, he would be the one doing the hunting. The wagon wheels creaked rhythmically as they rolled along the old mining trail, cutting through the darkness of the mountain pass. Jake kept the horses moving at a steady pace, not wanting to push them too hard, but knowing that every minute counted. Beside him, Sarah held onto the wagon seat with both hands, her knuckles white from the strain of the rough journey. They'd been traveling for nearly 6 hours, and the trail seemed to wind endlessly through the hills. "How much further do you think it is?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of the horses and wagon. Jake consulted the hand-drawn map that Doc Henderson had given them, squinting to make out the landmarks in the moonlight. "According to this, we should reach Silver Falls by mid-morning if we keep this pace. The trail levels out once we get through this pass." Behind them, the faint glow of torches appeared on the horizon, flickering like fireflies in the distance. Jake had been watching those lights for the past hour, hoping they were just late-night travelers or mining crews. But as the lights grew closer and more numerous, his worst fears were confirmed. "They're following us," Sarah said, having noticed the lights too. Jake nodded grimly and urged the horses to move faster. Blackwood's men. They must have figured out which way we went. The terrain made speed difficult, and Jake knew that men on horseback would eventually catch up to a wagon on these winding mountain paths. He scanned the trail ahead, looking for any advantage they might use. That's when he spotted something that gave him an idea. A narrow side trail that branched off to the left, leading up toward what looked like an abandoned mining camp. "Hold on tight," Jake warned Sarah as he steered the wagon onto the smaller trail. "This is going to get rough." The side trail was even more treacherous than the main mining road, with loose rocks and steep inclines that made the horses strain against their harnesses. but it also led them up to higher ground where they might be able to see their pursuers and plan their next move. After 20 minutes of climbing, they reached the abandoned mining camp that Jake had spotted from below. Several wooden buildings stood empty and weathered by years of mountain storms, but the structures were still solid enough to provide shelter. More importantly, the camp sat on a ridge that offered a clear view of the trail below. Jake helped Sarah down from the wagon and quickly unhitched the horses, leading them into what had once been a stable. From their elevated position, they could see the torches of their pursuers winding through the valley below, at least a dozen riders, just as Doc Henderson had warned. They'll reach this turnoff in about an hour, Jake estimated, watching the progress of the lights. Once they figure out we came this way, it won't take them long to find us. Sarah looked around the abandoned camp, taking in the empty buildings and broken equipment scattered about. Is there another way out of here? Jake studied the terrain beyond the camp, looking for any path that might lead back down to the main trail on the other side of the ridge. There was something that might work, a steep, rocky slope that dropped down into a different valley. It would be dangerous, especially in the dark, but it might be their only chance. There's a way down on the far side, Jake said, pointing toward the slope. But we'd have to leave the wagon behind and go on foot. It's going to be treacherous. Before Sarah could respond, they heard the sound of horses approaching up the side trail. Their pursuers had reached the turnoff sooner than expected, and there was no time to debate their options. This way, Jake whispered, grabbing their supply pack and leading Sarah toward the back of the camp. They made it to the edge of the ridge just as the first riders entered the mining camp below. Jake could see Marcus Blackwood among them, his bulk unmistakable even in the dim torchlight. The rancher was shouting orders to his men, directing them to search the buildings systematically. Jake found the beginning of what looked like an old game trail leading down the backside of the ridge. It was steep and narrow, but it seemed to be their best option for escape. He helped Sarah start down the treacherous path, staying close behind her in case she lost her footing. The descent was harrowing. Loose rocks shifted under their feet with each step, threatening to send them tumbling down the mountainside. Sarah's dress caught on thorny bushes, and Jake had to stop several times to free her. Above them, they could hear Blackwood's men searching the camp, their voices growing louder and more frustrated as they realized their quarry had escaped. "There! I can see tracks leading down the backside," someone shouted from above. Jake and Sarah picked up their pace, half running and half sliding down the steep slope. Behind them, they could hear horses and men beginning to follow, but the terrain was too dangerous for mounted pursuit. At least they were all on foot now. As they reached the bottom of the slope, Jake spotted a creek running through the valley floor. "The water will hide our tracks," he told Sarah, leading her into the shallow stream. They waded downstream for nearly a mile, the cold mountain water soaking through their boots and making every step a struggle. But it would make them much harder to track, buying them precious time to put distance between themselves and their pursuers. When they finally climbed out of the creek, both of them were exhausted and shivering from the cold water. Jake found a small grove of trees where they could rest and get their bearings. According to his estimation, they were still about 15 miles from Silver Falls, and they would have to cover that distance on foot. "I'm sorry," Sarah said, wrapping her arms around herself for warmth. "If it wasn't for me, you wouldn't be running for your life through these mountains." Jake pulled her close, sharing his body heat with her. "Don't you dare apologize. This isn't your fault. It's Garrett's and Blackwood's. And I'd rather spend my life running with you than living peacefully without you." As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Jake and Sarah resumed their journey toward Silver Falls. The terrain was gentler in this valley, allowing them to make better time despite their fatigue. Jake kept them moving parallel to what he hoped was the main road, staying far enough away to avoid detection but close enough to maintain their sense of direction. By mid-morning, they crested a hill and saw the town of Silver Falls spread out in the valley below. It was larger than Deadwood Creek, with several streets of buildings and what looked like a proper courthouse. More importantly, Jake could see the sheriff's office with its distinctive star-shaped sign hanging over the door. "We made it," Sarah said with relief, though Jake noticed she was limping from the long night of walking over rough terrain. They made their way down into the town, drawing curious stares from the residents who were going about their morning business. Jake knew they must look like refugees, with their torn clothes and exhausted faces, but he didn't care about appearances. All that mattered was reaching Sheriff Brady and getting Sarah to safety. The sheriff's office was a solid-looking building made of stone and timber, designed to withstand both weather and trouble. Jake pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside, helping Sarah to a chair near the front desk. Sheriff William Brady looked up from his paperwork, taking in their bedraggled appearance with sharp, intelligent eyes. He was a man in his 50s with greying hair and the kind of weathered face that came from years of dealing with dangerous people. But there was kindness in his expression as he took in Sarah's obvious distress. "I'm Jake Mitchell," Jake said without preamble. "Doc Henderson from Deadwood Creek said you might be able to help us." "This is my wife, Sarah, and she has information about Thomas Garrett's criminal operation." Brady's eyes widened at the mention of Garrett's name. "Doc Henderson sent you? That's good enough for me. Please, both of you sit down and tell me everything." Over the next hour, Sarah recounted her story of captivity and the network of criminals that Garrett had built. She provided details about the mountain camp, the other victims she'd seen come and go, and the connections between Garrett and buyers like Marcus Blackwood. Brady listened intently, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. "This is exactly the kind of testimony I need to build a federal case against Garrett," Brady said when Sarah finished her account. "But I have to warn you both. Once we move forward with this, you'll be in considerable danger until Garrett and his associates are captured." Jake leaned forward in his chair. "What kind of protection can you offer? I can keep Sarah safe here while we prepare the case, but it might take weeks or even months to gather enough evidence and coordinate with federal marshals. In the meantime, Blackwood and his men will be looking for both of you." As if summoned by Brady's words, the sound of approaching horses echoed from the street outside. Jake moved to the window and felt his blood turn cold. Marcus Blackwood and 6 of his men were dismounting in front of the sheriff's office, their faces grim and determined. "They found us," Jake said, his hand moving instinctively to his gun. Brady stood up and checked his own weapon. "How many men?" 7, including Blackwood. The sheriff moved to a gun cabinet and pulled out a shotgun, checking to make sure it was loaded. "Sarah, there's a back room with a heavy door and no windows. I want you to go there now and stay put until this is over." Sarah looked between Jake and Brady, fear evident in her eyes. "I'm not leaving Jake to face this alone." "You're not leaving me alone," Jake assured her. "You're staying safe so we can have a future together." "Please, Sarah, do what the sheriff says." Reluctantly, Sarah allowed Brady to escort her to the back room. Jake heard the sound of a heavy bolt being thrown, securing her behind the reinforced door. Then Brady returned to the main office, taking position behind his desk with the shotgun ready. The front door burst open, and Marcus Blackwood strode in with 3 of his men right behind him. The rest remained outside, presumably watching for any attempt at escape. Blackwood's face was flushed with anger, and his clothes were dusty from the hard ride through the mountains. "Sheriff Brady," Blackwood said with false politeness, "I'm here to collect my property. These 2 people stole something from me, and I want it back." Brady remained seated behind his desk, his shotgun resting casually across his lap. "What property would that be, Mr. Blackwood?" "The woman. I had the winning bid at yesterday's auction in Deadwood Creek, but these people interfered with a legal transaction." Jake stepped forward, his jaw clenched with anger. "You lying piece of—" Brady held up a hand to silence him. "Mr. Mitchell paid $400 for that woman at a legal auction. I have the bill of sale right here." He held up the document that Jake had gotten from the auctioneer. Blackwood's face darkened. "That auction was illegal. Those people were stolen property, and I can prove it. Then you should file charges through proper legal channels," Brady replied calmly. "But right now, you're in my town making threats, and I don't appreciate that." One of Blackwood's men, a thin gunfighter with cold eyes, shifted his position slightly. Jake recognized the movement as preparation for drawing a weapon, and he tensed accordingly. "I'm not leaving without what's mine," Blackwood declared. "And if you try to stop me, you'll regret it." Brady stood up slowly, the shotgun now held ready in his hands. "Mr. Blackwood, you and your men need to leave my office right now. If you have legal business to conduct, come back during normal hours with proper documentation." For a tense moment, nobody moved. Jake could feel the violence building in the room like pressure before a thunderstorm. Then Blackwood smiled coldly and nodded to his men. "Take them," he ordered. The gunfighter went for his weapon first, but Jake was faster. His Colt cleared leather in a smooth motion, and he put 2 bullets center mass into the man before he could complete his draw. At the same time, Brady's shotgun roared, catching another of Blackwood's men in the chest and sending him flying backward through the doorway. The 3rd gunman got off one wild shot before Jake's next bullet found its mark, dropping him to the wooden floor. Blackwood himself had drawn a small pistol, but Brady was already moving toward him with the business end of the shotgun. "Drop it, Blackwood," Brady commanded. Instead of complying, Blackwood spun toward the back of the office where Sarah was hidden. "If I can't have her, nobody can," he snarled, raising his gun toward the reinforced door. Jake's final shot took Blackwood in the head, ending his threat permanently. The rancher's body hit the floor with a heavy thud, his unfired gun clattering across the wooden planks. Outside, the remaining gunmen had heard the shots and were taking cover behind their horses, unsure of what had happened inside the office. Brady moved to the window and called out to them. "Your boss is dead, and you're outgunned. Ride out now, and there won't be any more trouble." After a few minutes of shouted discussion among themselves, the surviving gunmen mounted up and rode out of town at a gallop. Jake suspected they wouldn't be back. Without Blackwood to pay them, they had no reason to continue the fight. Brady unbolted the door to the back room and called out to Sarah, "It's over. You can come out now." Sarah emerged cautiously, looking around at the bodies scattered across the office floor. When she saw that Jake was unharmed, she ran to him and threw her arms around his neck, holding him tight. "I was so scared," she whispered against his shoulder. Jake held her close, feeling the adrenaline slowly drain from his system. "It's over now. Blackwood can't hurt you anymore." Brady was already organizing the cleanup, sending for the undertaker and writing his official report of the incident. "This was clearly self-defense," he assured Jake and Sarah. "Blackwood and his men forced their way into my office and threatened violence. You both acted within your rights." Over the following days, Brady helped coordinate Sarah's testimony with federal marshals who were building a case against Thomas Garrett's criminal network. Her detailed account of the operation, combined with information from other survivors, provided enough evidence to issue federal warrants for Garrett and his remaining associates. Jake and Sarah decided to settle in Silver Falls, at least temporarily. Brady offered Jake a job as a deputy sheriff, knowing that his skills with a gun and his experience tracking criminals would be valuable assets. It wasn't the quiet ranch life they'd once dreamed of, but it was honest work that would help other people avoid the suffering they'd endured. 3 months later, Jake stood on the porch of the small house they'd rented on the outskirts of Silver Falls, watching Sarah tend to the vegetable garden she'd planted in their backyard. She was wearing a simple blue dress, her auburn hair tied back with a yellow ribbon, and she looked more beautiful than ever. The haunted look had faded from her eyes, replaced by the joy and peace he remembered from their early days together. "Any word from the marshals?" Sarah asked, walking over to join him on the porch. Jake wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on top of her head. "They caught 3 more of Garrett's men down in New Mexico. Still no sign of Garrett himself, but they'll get him eventually." Sarah leaned back against him, enjoying the warmth of the afternoon sun. "Sometimes I still can't believe we made it through all of this. 3 years ago I thought I'd never see you again. But you never gave up hope," Jake reminded her. "That's what kept you strong enough to survive. And you never gave up looking for the truth. Even when everyone told you I was dead, we were meant to find each other again." Jake turned Sarah around in his arms so he could look into her green eyes. "I love you, Sarah Mitchell. I've loved you since the day I met you, and I'll love you until the day I die. And I love you, Jake Mitchell, always and forever." As they kissed on the porch of their new home, Jake thought about how different his life was now compared to just a few months ago. He'd been a drifter then, carrying his grief and guilt like heavy stones in his heart. Now he had purpose again, love again, hope for the future again. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. In the distance, Jake could see other families going about their evening routines. Children playing in yards, women hanging laundry on lines, men returning home from their jobs. It was the kind of peaceful, ordinary life that he and Sarah had always wanted. They still faced challenges, of course. Thomas Garrett was still out there somewhere, and there might be other members of his network who harbored grudges. But Jake no longer felt like he was fighting those battles alone. He had Sarah by his side, Sheriff Brady as a friend and ally, and a community that had accepted them despite their unusual past. As they walked inside their house, preparing for another quiet evening together, Jake reflected on the words Sarah had spoken at that auction in Deadwood Creek. She'd asked him to remember what he'd promised her under the old oak tree on their wedding day, that no matter what happened, no matter how dark things got, he would never give up on their love. He'd kept that promise even when he thought she was dead, and now, against all odds, they had the chance to build the life together that had been stolen from them 3 years ago. This time, Jake was determined to make sure nothing and no one would ever tear them apart again. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and a gentle breeze rustled through the trees around their home. Inside, Jake and Sarah Mitchell began their new life together, grateful for second chances and determined to make the most of every moment they'd been given.